So basically what's going to happen today, hopefully everybody can hear me at the back. I'm using my teacher's voice. Hopefully it's not too loud for people at the front. What I'm going to do is I'll do a quick little introduction and then I'll spend about 45 minutes or so talking a little bit about the history of the Paulson mine and the railway, and then there'll be some time for some questions and things like that afterwards. I'll be staying around here for a while. I'm staying with John for a few days. I'm actually going to be doing some railway field work for the next couple of days, so I have time afterwards to stay around if you have any more specific questions or things that you want to ask me. As John introduced me, my name is Dave Battistol, and I'm coming down to you from Thunder Bay. And as I said, I've been working on this railway project for 20 years now. I first got interested in it way back even before 1994 when I had my first experience with the railway out at North Lake. And what happened was probably about 94-ish, I went to the library and said, I'm going to pull out a book on this railway because I keep reading about this railway and I don't know anything about it. And lo and behold, I went to the library and there were no books about this railway. Right? There is a book now, but nothing had been written at the time. And so what I decided to do was that I started researching this, and I sort of got hooked. And here I am 20 years later. This has sort of become sort of a bit of a very important pastime for me. I guess in the real world, I am a history teacher, go figure. So I've been doing that, thankfully for the last 16 years. And what it does is it gives me an opportunity to spend my summers doing stuff like this, going out and speak and going out and doing things like some field work and some research. I just came back from a little vacation in Toronto, and while I was there, I spent a morning in the archives in Toronto looking up some stuff on the railway. So it seems like I never get away from it. So as I said, today's presentation is going to be about the Paulson mine and the railway. Some of you may remember me being here 2 years ago, and I spoke about both those topics. Last time my presentation was a little bit more tilted towards the railway. Today it's going to be a little bit more emphasis on the mine. And so, like I said, I'll get rolling here, unless I sort of talk, set my timer here, make sure I don't go overboard. I guess one of the first things that when you're doing a presentation like this, you always need a starting point, somewhere you need to get things rolling with. And when you're talking about things like the railway and you're talking about things like the Paulson mine, really it all traces back even before the railway was built, even before the mine was the exploration of the mine happened, and that goes back. I don't know how far back in history you want to go, but really it's all part and parcel of the Industrial Revolution that really started to gather steam in the early part of the 1800s and really start to pick up in the mid 1800s. And there were really two big things that were going on during that period. Transportation became very important, particularly railways. We saw the development of the steam engine, and it was very, very important. Not only in places like Europe, but I'll allude to this a little bit later on, in places like North America. And it took off very, very quickly. And some of you, might be a little bit more versed in history than others. Certainly, it was a very important chapter in the history of the United States. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit more sort of about the Canadian end of things a little bit later on. But it was a very, very important thing in terms of opening up, especially interior areas like this. The interior part of the United States and interior part of Canada. And one of the key elements to making all that happen was something that was very rapidly becoming a very important resource, which was iron. And really all of that started to unfold really about the middle of the 1800s. And what we saw during that period was the process by which that steel is made from iron. Two big developments happened, the Bessemer and the Siemens method, in terms of refining iron and making it into the modern steel that we have today. So what that did was it basically triggered a big boom in the prospecting for iron and the mining of iron. And here in the United States, that started about in the mid 1800s. When you're taking a look at the interior part of the United States, first of all, it started in Michigan with the discovery and the development of the Marquette Range, and eventually that spread into places like Wisconsin. And then here in Minnesota, it wasn't until about the 1860s. And some of you might be familiar with some of the stories of some of the iron mines in the area. Really, place that really got things going was the discovery of iron at Lake Vermilion and that happened in the 1860s. And it wasn't just the discovery of iron, it was the quality of the iron as well. What really drove things as well was the fact that the price of iron was very, very high. And this very, very high price, and the fact that people were starting to look at places like the Marquette Range, and they're going, are we going to run out of iron? Is there other places that we need to exploit? And so that really what got the big iron boom going in Minnesota. One of the big issues that they had was, now how do we get this iron out? How do we get it out from places like Lake Vermilion and the cities that started popping up in that area? And the answer to that was obviously railways. And so the opening up of the Vermilion Range began in 1883 with the construction of the Duluth and Iron Range Railway, and eventually it was completed a year later, and iron began flowing from places like Tower. Shortly thereafter, they began discovering iron all along what would become the Vermilion Range, as far up north as places like Ely. And in 1888, the Duluth and Iron Range built another extension farther up to Ely. What was interesting about that extension was the cost. The cost seemed to grow exponentially, and the cost of that little extension was about $27,000 per mile at the time. I remember that number because I'm going to come back to it a little bit later on. And so, because of all these things that were happening, demand of iron was booming, and sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. The U.S. iron production, American iron production, would increase 10 times between 1880 and 1900. And so there was a massive boom going on with the production of iron. So that brings us to the Gunflint area. Where does this all sort of tie in? Well, the first time that iron was ever mentioned in this area dates back to 1825. And then about 25 years later, there was some geological prospecting that was done, and there was some suggestion that there might be substantial deposits of iron in this area. Eventually they started sort of looking at the geology of the area and started figuring out, well, maybe we've got iron down in Lake Vermilion, and then there's iron up here. And so geologically speaking, people started looking at a possible connection between the two iron ranges. What started, really the ball rolling per se was in the 1870s when people from Grand Marais started making their way into this area. Initially, they weren't looking for iron; they were looking for more valuable things. They were looking for things like silver, gold, and copper. A lot of that was influenced in some part to events that were actually happening north of the border. From the area that I come from, you might be familiar with places like Silver Islet, okay, which is located on the tip of the Sydney Peninsula. Huge silver mine that was located there for quite a number of years. That range extends southwest of Thunder Bay, and so there was all kinds of silver deposits that were being opened up, and so logically people were saying, well, if there's silver there, there's got to be silver on this side of the border as well. And so that's what sort of tipped off a lot of the explorations. And really the person that we owe a lot of credit to doing all this is someone that probably a lot of you are familiar with, which is Henry Mayhew. And he started coming into this area looking for the gold and the silver and the copper. There were some discoveries. There were, a few little shafts and test pits and things dug, but nothing really substantial that came out of it. What was really the big discovery that he made was in 1886 on Gunflint Lake. He discovered what would turn out to be some fairly substantial deposits of iron. And eventually, as I said, they determined that this iron deposit basically ran from sort of just southwest of Gunflint Lake all the way up into Canada to Whitefish Lake, which is about 50 miles from here. And eventually this became known as the Gunflint Range. And as I said, a lot of people recognize that as a sort of an extension of the Mesabi Range that was in the United States. And you can find little diagrams like this on the internet, right, where you basically see the Mesabi Range, and then there's a geological formation called the Duluth Complex, okay, which basically pushes into the area and separates the two ranges. So that sort of tipped things off, and around about even before he made discoveries, ironically enough, there were parcels of land that were being bought up, and a lot of that was happening in and around the area where you see the Centennial Trail today, right where those iron shafts and test pits are. That same year, something very interesting happened in Minneapolis. A little corporation called the State Bank of Minneapolis was incorporated. And that would be a very, very important entity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Shortly thereafter, about a year and a half later, in December of 1886, another corporation was created. It was called the American Realty Company. And both of these enterprises were basically started and sort of were the brainchild of two very, very important people, one by the name of John Paulson and the other by the name of Christian Courtguard. Now, what's sort of interesting about the first guy, John Paulson, he sort of developed this mystique, this persona to him. For many, many years, John Paulson was sort of this enigmatic figure, right? Nobody knew who he was. There was a lot of people that have even suggested that that it was a fabrication, that he didn't exist. If you basically read the two books about the railway and the iron mining in the area, one of which is, some of you have probably read it, which is Willis Raff's Pioneers in the Wilderness, and then the other one, which is the Thunder Bay to Gunflint, which is a book about the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway. At the time when those books were published, there wasn't a lot of information about who exactly John Paulson was, and that's why I said a lot of people think that he was this sort of mythical character, that maybe he was even a fabrication, that he didn't exist. And what's happened in the last number of years is a lot of information has come to light on who John Paulson was and sort of where he came from, and working with a number of people. It took me a bit of time, but I was basically able to piece together his entire life, and it's quite an interesting story. And just as a little bit of a side note, while I was away on vacation in Toronto, I get an email from a lady, and she's a history professor at Minnesota State University in Mankato. And as it turns out, she says to me, she goes, "Oh, I happen to be looking on the internet, and I've noticed that you've been doing some stuff on John Paulson." Now, just to let you know, there are lots of John Paulsons today and back then, and it made it very difficult doing a lot of this research, trying to figure out which John Paulson we're talking about. Right? So there was quite a few of them floating around. So as it turns out, she's actually doing some research on John Paulson, and so there was a number of emails that sort of flew back and forth. And as it turns out, I think she's sort of doing the research that she's doing is more from the immigrant experience end of things. And so I'll mention this a little bit later on, but she's actually suggested, and we're sort of looking into, we're actually thinking about sort of co-authoring an article about John Paulson. And we're going to see if we can get it published maybe in a couple of years. I'm currently working on something else, but maybe by next year things will freed up a little bit and be able to work on it. Okay, so who was John Paulson? Basically, he was an immigrant from Norway. His father was Norwegian, his mother was Swedish. Comes from a place in Norway called Chik-Wauk. Was born in 1840. Emigrated to the United States in 1850. Initially ended up in Wisconsin, and then his family from Wisconsin made their way down to a place called Decorah, Iowa, which apparently, from my research, there's lots of Scandinavians in the area. Seemed to be sort of a mecca for a lot of Scandinavian immigrants in the area. And then from there, eventually he made his way up to St. Paul. And when the Civil War broke out in 1862, he enlisted in the Army. Initially, and this is where it got a little bit confusing, because it shows him being a part of a couple different units. So he was involved with. I'm trying to remember the exact wording of it. He was involved with the Sioux uprising, and I know that there were a number of sort of irregular units that were created to sort of deal with that situation. It also shows him enlisting in Company H of the 9th Minnesota Volunteers, and so we actually have a photograph of what he looks like. So this is his picture, Private Paulson. And so we do sort of know what he looks like. From there, he was involved with, like I said, the Sioux uprising, and then eventually he was involved in several battles a year later in sort of the western sphere of the American Civil War, places like Kentucky. Trying to think some of the other places that he was involved with. Eventually, what happened in 1864, he was discharged. I think by that point he had risen to the rank of corporal. He discharged, and then what happens is he re-enlists, and apparently this was I know a fair bit about American history, but not all the nuances. Was very commonplace for people to get their discharge from the military and then re-up. And so what he did was he got his discharge so he could re-enlist, this time as an officer. And what happened was he was appointed a captain of one of the colored regiments, and apparently he bounced around between a couple of them. And then so he served out the remainder of the war as an officer in one of these colored regiments. It did mention, an article I found did mention that he got involved in some sort of mining somewhere in the southern states. It's not very specific about it. Once the war ended, he stayed in the military and eventually was posted to Texas. And he remained in the military until about 1867. And then got his discharge and made his way to Wilmar. And the reason why he went to Wilmar because his older brother Ole Paulson was a minister in Wilmar, and so he settled in Wilmar, opened a business, became very, very close with a guy by the name of Albert Rice, who at the time was the lieutenant governor of Minnesota. And so from there, his business began to grow. He eventually branched off into several other things. It got sort of involved in some of the mining. So there are, he did own or was, I guess, an investor in some mining firms in places like Wisconsin. And so he did, so he was fairly well, well regarded, well attached person. And like I said, his friendship with Albert Rice basically meant that he was a very highly regarded person. We're not quite sure how he sort of got involved with everything that was happening here. Somehow or another, he must have found out what was happening, and obviously, what sort of drove him was what happened, on the Vermilion Range, right? We basically saw people get involved, and they ended up making fortunes, right? And so that was the draw for people like John Paulson. So obviously, he'd heard that there was iron in the lands here, and so he basically organized this bank, and then the bank helped to organize this American Realty Company, and then they began buying up lands, particularly in Section 28 and Section 29 of Township 65, Range 4 West, here in Cook County. I hate to say it like this, his partner in crime, and that's a big part of the story too. Is there was always this mystique about John Paulson. There was also a lot of stories too about was this real? Was it was it a big sham? Was there a lot of shady stuff going on? There were shenanigans going on, and there is that element to it. And I'm pretty good friends with Lee Johnson, who's the archaeologist with Superior National Forest. And Lee and I have talked about this a few times, and I'm of the opinion that I don't think this was a scam per se. I don't think they got involved in this to sort of hose people. I think this was a pretty legitimate thing. Basically what we've learned about John Paulson and the people that he sort of had around him, he was a pretty upstanding citizen, right? He was a pretty well-regarded person, and I honestly think that, he was, looking, to strike it rich here. And yeah, some of the things that were done were not so on the up and up. And I'll talk more about those in a second. I think there were some good intentions there. So his partner in crime, and the reason why I say that was unfortunately this gentleman here, going by the name of Christian Kortgaard. Kortgaard, unfortunately, when everything sort of the fallout of everything happened in 1893 and 1894, unfortunately, Kortgaard went to jail for embezzlement. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So what we know was happening was that the realty company was buying up lands in this area. Some of the lands we know from title searches, and you can do them. They can be found fairly simply. Places like Ancestry.com, right? Believe it or not, you can actually see all of the transactions because they do have those sale documents on there. And so some of the lands were purchased in Paulson's name, some were purchased in Kortgaard's name, some of them were purchased in their wives' name. So there's a little bit of the shenanigans that were going on. What we think was happening, okay, and based on the embezzlement, I think what was happening was they were taking money from the bank and they were using it to buy these lands because obviously, there's a lot of money involved to buy the land, to finance all the diggings that were going on. And like most of us, there's only so much money to go around. And so I think what they were intending to do was to do this, and then when they struck it rich, just quietly push all the money back, and then nobody was the wiser, right? Unfortunately, we know that that's not the way that it turned out. So work began on a lot of the diggings in 1887. By 1888, some of the test pits that some of you may have seen along the Centennial Trail, we believe that those were done in that somewhere around that time frame. We know that they were using a diamond drill to do some of the digging. It mentions the establishment of a camp, a mining camp, around about Section 28, which is where today we believe a place called Gunflint City was located, which I'll talk more about later. Lost my page here. And then by 1889, there were apparently 3 shafts that were dug, including two in Section 28 and then one in Section 29, which is now on the west side of Mine Lake. If you've ever been down that far, I was just down there in June. Unfortunately, I was kind of disappointed what I saw. It was actually one of the best preserved mine shafts, but now with the blowdown and the fire, there's no cover, and so there's all this brush growing up in the mine shaft. You can't even see the hole anymore. So it's very, very unfortunate. Okay, so at this point, what I'm going to do is we're just going to sort of switch gears a little bit, and what we're going to do is we're going to sort of direct our attention, our focus a little bit on some stuff that was happening up in Canada. Now, really, if you read the little write-up for this presentation, you really can't separate the history of these two entities. You can't look at the Paulson mine and look at the railway as two separate things. They are basically very, very intertwined. You have a mine that needs some sort of outlet for its product, and then you basically have a railway that has been specifically built into this area with the purpose of accessing not only the iron that's on this side of the border, but the iron that's on the Canadian side of the border, right? So these two things are very much tied in together. And I mentioned earlier in the presentation how railways were very, very important, not only around the world, but specifically here in North America. And like I said, a lot of you might be familiar with the construction of the railways especially across the American West, right? And how important that was. In Canada, it's even more important. And the reason being is because we have a country that is slightly larger than yours with 10 times less population. In 1870, right, so a few years after the American Civil War, 3 years after Canada became a country, there are 70 million people in the United States. In Canada, there are 3. Okay, so there's a bit of a population discrepancy. And so for us, the railways were huge because it basically allowed us to get into areas that were previously inaccessible. And one of the big reasons why, please forgive me here, is we were afraid of you guys. This is one of the topics that comes up. Like I said, I am a history teacher, and this comes up every year. Our high school students have to take at least one history credit, and so I tell the students that I teach every year that we were next door to a very, very angry country at the end of the American Civil War. Okay? Our parent country, Britain, had supported the South during the Civil War, and so we had a lot of angry Americans. Okay, and the best place to direct that anger towards is, well, what's the closest place? It's Canada. And so there was a lot of fear here north of the border of what could potentially happen. I guess the best way to understand it was one of our former prime ministers, Pierre Trudeau, said that living next to the United States is like being in bed with an elephant. Right? It's either going to protect you or it's going to squish you, right? And that's sort of the relationship that we have. And so at the time, there's a lot of people here in Canada were afraid that we were going to get squished, right? That there was Americans were going to flood up into our west, into our prairies, and basically drive a wedge between Canada. So it's very important that we get these railways going and basically solidify our stake our claim to our territory. And so railways became a huge, huge part in the industrial and political and cultural development in Canada. So for the Thunder Bay area, railways became very, very important because we were one of those places that really was sort of out on an island on its own. We had access by water in the summer months, but in the winter months, it was basically like living in the middle of nowhere. one of the things that sort of got a lot of people sort of thinking about what would eventually be the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western Railway was when the first Canadian Transcontinental Railway, the Canadian Pacific, was built. At the time, there were two cities that used to be Thunder Bay. If some of you know your history, it used to be Fort William and Port Arthur. Well, there was a lot of politics that was going on. Go figure. And what happened is that the railway chose Fort William as the terminus or as the main focal point for their railway, and of course, Port Arthur, okay, being the sister city, obviously was very, very upset that this decision had been made, and they sort of got cut out of the pie. And so they basically said, well, if we can't, it goes through our area, but we want our own railway, right? We want to basically assert our own claim. We want to make our own money. And so they started looking at building their own railway. And one of the areas that they wanted to go towards was south, right? And a lot of people had aspirations of building, and listen, just in Thunder Bay, places like Manitoba, everybody wanted to build railways south. And the reason why was because they felt that if they could get into the United States, a lot of the freight rates and things were cheaper. The only unfortunate part was that when the Canadian Pacific Railway was built, the company signed an agreement with the government, and it was basically a little bit of collusion here, and the government basically told everybody to protect our one transcontinental railway. Nobody will be allowed to build railways south of the Canadian Pacific for a certain period of time, right? Because they didn't want competition, right? And there was a lot of people that were upset about that. At the time in Canada, you could get a railway charter from the federal government, but you could also go to the province. And so what happened was the people in Thunder Bay tried the federal government first, and they basically got told to hit the road. So they tried the provincial government, and they basically got a charter for a railway, and they said, well, we're not going to go south, we're going to go west. And if we end up going south in the process, well, maybe that happens. So in 1883, something called the Thunder Bay Colonization Railway was incorporated. It was supposed to build from Prince Arthur's Landing to a place on Arrow Lake. Unfortunately, try as they might, never got anything going. So 4 years later, they decided, well, we're having problem in attracting investors, and we're having problems sort of getting the financing. Maybe we'll change the name. Maybe the name is the problem. So in 1887, they changed the name of the railway to the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western Railway to really reflect the general idea of the railway. By this time, the federal government has changed their mind. They're now allowing railways into the United States. And so they also changed the route of the railway. And so now what they're going to do is they're still going to go towards Arrow Lake, but they're going to continue in the southwesterly direction down to Gudflip Lake and hopefully across the border into Minnesota. Unfortunately, they still can't build the railway. They try in 1887. They clear about 9 miles of railway, get it all graded. Falls apart. Not enough financing, not enough money. All right, so back to the drawing board a year later, and now they approach the federal government for financing. They say, look, this is a good project. We're injecting jobs, and hopefully all this iron will bring a lot of prosperity to the area. So the federal government says, okay, we'll give you some money. And so now they have the backing of the federal government. The problem is they still don't have all of the money that they need. They still need a lot of private investing. And unfortunately, it takes them another year. So it takes them until 1889 to get all the money in place to start building the railway. And so construction begins on the railway in August of 1889. They build approximately 19 miles of railway. Unfortunately, by the time January rolls around, all of a sudden things are starting to grind to a halt again. And it appears that money, again, is becoming a bit of an issue. And this is a point in which really the history of the railway takes a very interesting turn. Because all of a sudden, some new people get involved in the history of the railway. Really up until that point, a lot of the people that were backing the railway were a lot of local people from Thunder Bay. And it's this point where all of a sudden we start to see people from outside of Thunder Bay getting involved. And those people are coming in from places like Toronto. And I've done a lot of research on this. Unfortunately, I've never been able to sort of find the smoking gun as to, specifically why these people, in a place like Toronto, and I drove to Toronto, and if you know anything about Canadian geography, it's 15 hours to drive from Thunder Bay to Toronto, so it is a long ways away. And why somebody that far away would get involved in a little railway here in this part of the world, I haven't found the direct link, so I haven't found that smoking gun. I have a little bit of circumstantial evidence that I'll mention, but there's no exact reason why. So two of the most prominent people that get involved with the railway is, first of all, a guy by the name of Hugh Blaine, who's involved in the grocery business in Toronto, and then a colleague of his by the name of Arthur Lee, and he's involved in the hardware business. And so basically, they, along with some people they know, get involved with the railway, and so all of a sudden things start to perk up. And so, as I said, the question becomes is why did they get involved in this? And like I said, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Basically, what it points to is the fact that at the time, mines and railways were the investment, right? So I don't know how some of you are with the stock market right now and investing. Back then, railways and mines were like the blue chip investment, right? If you were looking to make money, right, these were the things that you invested in. Did it work out all the time? No, right? I mean, I would probably venture to guess that more than 50% of these ventures failed. But if you were looking to strike it rich, these were the big payoff things that you need to get involved with. Some of these individuals had been involved with railways before, and here's the little circumstantial evidence that I came up with. In the summer of 1889, there was an organization called the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I don't know all of their information. I don't know how long they were around for. But in the summer of 1889, they had a conference. And so that year they had their conference in Toronto. And I don't know how I sort of got onto this. I think I was looking at it because a lot of the Toronto people are all sort of connected together. And I was happening to look at this document, and then I sort of came across the list of people who were speaking at this. And so a couple of the names kind of caught my attention. Well, some of the speakers that happened to be at this conference were a number of Minnesota geologists by the name of Winchell. And if you know anything about the geology of this area and the geology of Minnesota, you will know that the Winchells were very, very important in the 1800s in developing the geology of Minnesota. They basically wrote, and I mean, it wasn't all their information. They were basically compiling a lot of things as well too, but they wrote the geological history of Minnesota. And so there were a couple of the Winchells speaking at this conference. And so it's the only thing that I've actually found that sort of ties everything in together. So, maybe, these guys speaking at this conference in Toronto talking about, the iron that could be found in northern Minnesota. Maybe this sort of got some of these Toronto guys thinking. I don't know. But as I said, all of a sudden now money starts to pour in. The railway resumes again, starts building. At the time, more good news pours in because all of a sudden now report starts coming out of Ely that the Duluth and Iron Range in the summer of 1891 are going to start sending out surveyors. Right, they're going to send out guys to start looking at a line between Ely and Gunflint Lake. So now they think this is perfect, awesome. We bring the railway down to the border, and all of a sudden now the Duluth and Iron Range build the extension from Ely to Gunflint Lake, and now we have a railway that you can basically go all the way down to Duluth. We can pull all the iron out of northern Minnesota because it's the shortest distance. Okay, we're sitting pretty. Unfortunately, the whole Duluth and Iron Range angle sort of falls apart because what happens is when their surveyors come back, they haven't even finished their survey, and the report's already coming in. And that's like, right? They start looking at the country between here and Ely, and that's on my bucket list, part of my research. I want to do the Keck all the way from here to Ely. I want to see what it looks like on the ground. But they come back and they look at it and they go, it's not worth us building it. It's going to be a lot of money to build that extension, right? So at the time they look at it and they say, it's not worth us to build that, right? The Canadians go, oh well, we'll proceed. We're going to build our railway down to the Paulson line, and we're going to get our iron, and we'll be golden. So what ends up happening is by the end of 1891, by the start of 1892, the railway has now extended their line all the way down to North Lake. And now all that remains is they've got 15 miles left to build in Canada, and they've just got to build a little piece into Minnesota, and everything's awesome. So, switching back to what was happening with the mine, a lot of things start happening in 1892. So in March of 1892, we have a very, very important announcement. John Paulson, Christian Courtyard, and a guy by the name of Orrin Kinney, who at the time was from Ely, they incorporate a company called the Gunflint Lake Iron Company, right? So this is the corporate entity that is going to basically mine the ore and basically eventually ship it through Canada and on to be processed. How Kinney got involved with Cartgard and Paulson, I'm not sure. Once again, there's no memoirs. There's no, as far as we know, there's no secret letters and things like that. As far as we know, Kinney was born in Pennsylvania. Once again, I believe he was involved in the Civil War, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of people, a lot of histories there that you have to sort of try to remember. Eventually made his way to Ely, and then after the whole sort of debacle that happened here, eventually made his way down to the Virginia area, and was one of the people that actually discovered some of the iron in the Virginia area. And the city of Kinney, which is just sort of southwest of Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, is actually named after him. So a little bit of an interesting connection there. So by this point, there are those 3 shafts that have been dug in Section 28 and Section 29. They range from 75 to 105 feet deep. In July of 1892, the Gunflint Lake Company signs a contract with the railway to ship 1 million tons of ore over 10 years. So we ship 100,000 tons of ore in a 10-year period. So this is great news, right? The railway's almost done. They've got a contract to ship the ore. Everything's looking awesome. Now, one of the interesting things that they have to do as well is that, I mean, the railway only has a mandate to build a line as far as the end of Gunflint, right? They can only build to Gunflint Narrows. They can't cross the border, right? So in order to do that, what they have to do is they actually have to get a charter to build an American railway. That happens in April of 1892. The state of Minnesota incorporates a railway called the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway of Minnesota. The people that are on the list of incorporation are Paulson and Cartgard, James Conmee, who, very interesting character, is one of the contractors building the railway, but also happens to be the member of parliament, so the main politician for our area. So kind of a little bit of a, I guess back today, there would be a lot of conflict of interest happening, right? You basically have a guy that's building a railway, but also potentially reaping a lot of the political rewards from having that railway being built, right? So I don't see that happening today. The other people that are on the incorporation list are Lewis Reed, Freeman Lane, and Matthew Walsh, who are all very, very prominent Minneapolis businessmen. Kind of very interesting as well. I'm not an expert on American politics, but it's very interesting that Reed and Lane are both Republicans and Walsh is a Democrat. So it's kind of an interesting concoction there, a little bit interesting meshing of political ideas. And so basically, their railway is chartered to build from the Gunflint Narrows to a place called Fraser Lake, which is approximately 20 miles. Eventually, the construction on that will get started. Now, and when I mentioned that they only had 15 miles left to build in Canada and then a few miles here in the States, what they didn't realize was this was going to be the most difficult section of railway to build. If you've ever done any hiking or any exploring on Gunflint Lake or North Lake and you've sort of seen the railway in that area, it'll give you a little bit of an indication of why it took them an entire year to build 15 miles of track. I've been over that area a lot, and there basically is 2 things they did in that area. They either blasted or they built bridges, right? Because it is all just rock or swamp or big valleys where they had to bridge in. And so there was a lot of work that was done. One of the things that really helped them out a lot was the fact that they had a little steamboat. They had a little tugboat that was working up and down on North and Gunflint Lakes. It's a little tug by the name of Xena. I do believe in the gift shop here they do have little postcards with the picture of the Xena on it. So it moved back and forth bringing supplies because obviously they were blasting well ahead of the railway. And once again, there's no definitive information, but all indications is that the little railroad, and some of you know where I'm talking about, between Little North and Little Gunflint, there's a little portage in there. And years ago, it used to run. John was kind enough to show me a little video from when he was a kid, a little home video of John in a boat being pushed across that little railroad from Little Gunflint into Little North. Once again, it does mention, newspaper accounts do mention things being transferred, but it doesn't specifically say that this little railroad existed. But we know that Justine Kerfoot, when she came here in the 1920s, she said that it was here. And there are some other little bits and pieces that suggest that it dates to the railway period. By the summer of 1892, there's 800 men at work, and more men are pouring in every day. They're trying to get this railway built as quickly as possible. One of the big challenges they have is they have to build a 1,000-foot trestle across a bay on North Lake, which you can imagine was quite the undertaking, especially if you've been there and you've seen it. Once again, the construction on, especially on Gunflint Lake, was very, very difficult. There's places that if you boat along the lake, you'll notice that the entire shoreline has been blasted out. There's one place, I call it the retaining wall. There's one place where you can actually see that they've actually had to build a retaining wall, which is still there, to hold everything from sliding into the lake. And I remember talking to a few people, and they said, "Oh yeah, it's pretty deep there." So I don't know if it was the last time I did the presentation here. It was in the last couple of years I went there with my boat, and I actually took my depth finder, and the depth of the water right off that retaining wall is about 13 feet. You move about 20 feet off the shore, and it drops to 100 feet. All right, so this is the challenge that they had. Everything was just, potential just sliding right into the lake, and it's amazing that it's 120 years old, 122 years old, but you can see if you go there and you look at it, and it's like, wow, it's in pretty good shape for that. You can see the timbers and the rods and the pins and everything they used to hold it in. While they were doing this, there was a number of construction camps that were located on Gunflint Lake. There was, in the beginning, they were on the eastern end of the lake, right where it dumps into Little Gunflint, and then by November they were on the western end of the lake, right near where eventually the town of Lee Blaine would be located. We know that a number of these workers were immigrants, new immigrants to Canada. In particular, there were a lot of Italians that were working on that, and some of you are familiar with the ovens that were constructed there to bake bread. So they basically made these igloo-shaped ovens out of rock, and they baked their bread inside. There are 4 that we know of that are located there. Apparently there is a 5th. Bruce Kerfoot told me there is a 5th one that apparently was in pieces when he remembers it. And I haven't tracked that one down, but we know the location of 4 of them. Some of them are still in really good shape. The work on the railway is very difficult, and probably the best example we have of that is in October 1892, there was a worker was killed during the construction of the railway. His name was Joseph Montegia. They were blasting a rock cut, and unfortunately what happened was that not all of the charges detonated. And so what happened was they waited, and so they said, okay, well, is this charge going to go off? They went back, and I guess they were trying to remove some of the rock to see where the charge was, and unfortunately it went off. And so this poor fellow, they're actually pretty graphic in the newspaper how they describe what happened to him. Basically caught it right in the face, and so he was killed instantly. And so to mark where he was killed, his fellow workers carved a cross in the side of the rock cut, and that cross is still there today. Unfortunately, somebody decided to mark it. They wrote in white paint on top of it. They put his name. Unfortunately, spelled his name wrong. So on my to-do list is I'm going to go there and hopefully try to scrape off the paint. And we're looking at trying to get maybe a proper sign or something up there as opposed to painting on the side of the rock. Okay, so by September of 1892, they're now in Minnesota. And if you thought that the rock work on Gunflint Lake was bad, well, if you've ever walked the Centennial Trail or seen any parts of the railway here in Minnesota, it's even worse. Initially, they thought that it would be about $125,000 to build this section of railway. It ends up being double that amount. And so what it ends up works out to be, the Canadian side cost about $16,000 per mile to build. I remember when I talked to you about building that little section of the Duluth and Iron Range from Ely to Tower. This section of line ended up costing, the 6 miles here in Minnesota ended up costing almost $41,000 per mile. Right? And like I said, if you've ever been on the Centennial Trail and you've seen the rock cuts and you've seen that big 400-foot trestle, and you've seen all the work that they had to do, you can understand why it cost so much. Quite an elaborate amount of work that they had to do. I've, for the most part, traced the whole railway, right from the Narrows to the Paulson line. Like I said, the Centennial Trail does a good job of sort of describing it to you. They're in the process of cutting out some more areas as well. There's a big loop that they build around the swamp, because where they were after they crossed the Cross River 4 times, they had to go up 200 feet. Trains don't climb hills very well. So what they had to do is they had to come up with a way to climb 200 feet. So what they did was they built a big loop through a swamp, Then they, right by the Round Lake Road, they built 2 rock cuts and 2 trestles, then cut across another bunch of trestles, big 400-foot trestle, and eventually made their way to the Paulson mine. So by the end of December 1892, the railway is done. It's completed. It's ready to go. And so on January 4th, 1893, big event, right? There's all the papers in Thunder Bay are all big splashy about it. So there is a special train that leaves Port Arthur. All kinds of dignitaries on the train, all the leading citizens of Thunder Bay, all the investors from Toronto, even have an American customs inspector on there, right? Because they're going to be crossing the border. Got to make everything official. And so basically they tour the whole line, all the way to the Paulson mine. When they get to the Paulson mine, John Paulson's there to greet them and basically gives them a tour of the mine site. And everybody's excited because 1893 is going to be the year and all this great stuff is going to happen. The same day that happened, something very important happens on the Canadian side of the border, is that on the way down, they stop at that construction site on the western end of Gunflint Lake. And this is the site of the construction camp, and the railway's decided, because it is the sort of last spot before the railway is going to cross into the United States, that this is going to be our major Canadian terminal point. And that area is really the only piece of flat ground in quite a ways. So they decide that this is going to be our major Canadian terminal point. So we're going to build a station here. And unlike a lot of the other stations on the line, it wasn't like a log cabin. It was made from sawn lumber. Okay, it was approximately 40 by 20 feet. And they had to come up with a name. They had to figure out, what are we going to call this place? So they start throwing out some names. And so eventually they decide that, you know what we're going to do is we're going to name this after all these people that gave us the money to build the railway. So they start throwing out some name combinations of all these Toronto people. And finally they settle on using the last name of Arthur Lee and then the last name of Hugh Blaine. And so the town of Lee Blaine is christened. The proper spelling is Leeblain. There's a lot of permutations out there, but that is the correct spelling. And there's a lot of hope that this will be a huge metropolis. This is going to be this, and it's kind of funny, I was talking with John and Julie before the presentation here and talking about how it, you look across the lake and there's nothing there today. And sometimes when I go there, I sort of look around sometimes and I sort of think of, had this happened, what would this town have looked like, right? What would it, how would it be laid out? So what's happening at the Gunflint mine? What's happening at the Paulson mine? Well, work continues in 1893. Newspapers are gushing. You read all these newspaper reports, and they're saying that all these great things are going to happen. John Paulson says that there are 5,000 tons of ore ready to ship. Now, if you've ever hiked the Centennial Trail or been some in there, there's some spots where it looks like there are some piles of rocks, and I don't know about 5,000 tons, but there looks like some places where there's accumulations of rock. So, maybe that was true. One of the most interesting developments, and there was a map that was published to go along with this, was that there, just like on the Canadian side at Lee Blaine, there was going to be a city that was going to be created here, right where the mining camp was. And this city was going to be christened Gunflint City. And it was going to be sort of the star of northern Minnesota. It was going to be, once again, this great metropolis. And one of the most interesting stories from that was that one of Thunder Bay's, I don't know what the right word that I want to use to describe this, notorious, infamous business people decided that she was going to throw her hand in this, and that lady's name was Margaret Matthews. And some of you know this story. Marg Matthews was a madam. And so, but she was very, it's kind of interesting. I was contacted by a woman a few years ago, and she lives in southern Ontario because Mag Matthews is originally from Owen Sound, which is on the sort of south shore of Lake Huron. And so she was sort of doing a biography of Mag Matthews, and it was kind of funny. She wanted to come up here because I thought she was going to, in her head, I guess she thought she was going to come up here and be able to see this hotel that Mag built. And I'm like, we don't even know where it is, right? So I think I squashed that idea and maybe took the wind out of her sails a little bit. But so she looked at this as a business venture, and Meg was very, very well known in Thunder Bay, obviously for her business, but also she was a very, very shrewd businesswoman. She tended to help a lot of people. There was a lot of charity work that she did, and so she decided that she looked at this and she said, we have this railway, we have this mine, and there's going to be a lot of work, and there's going to be a lot of obviously a lot of single men working in there, and obviously they need to be entertained. So in the fall of 1892, she had a hotel that was built. And once again, there's a lot of conjecture about where exactly it was located. I know in Eleanor Barr's book about the railway, she sort of pins it a little bit more where the Gunflint Trail meets the railway by the Cross River. I think a lot of our evidence suggests that it was at Gunflint City. I know that for this presentation I was rereading a few things from Dr. Raff's book, and I know when they did some exploration there, they did find some women's shoes and things like that up at Gunflint City, so that's where we think it was located. We know there was approximately about 19 structures at Gunflint City. Unfortunately, there's no pictures of the Paulson mine, there's no pictures of Gunflint City, there's nothing. The only, I guess, picture that I've seen is Howard Sievertson did a painting a number of years ago. It's in one of his books, and it's called Gunflint City, and it sort of shows his little recreation. I think he went up there and did a little bit of exploring with Dr. Raff, and they sort of came up with what they sort of envisioned it sort of looking like. So they do have there is a map that was published. It was entitled the Gunflint Iron Range, and right here, oops, as I close my presentation, there's a little Gunflint City right here, right in the middle of section 28. It does show a little bit of the potential route of the railway, and shows all the lands that are owned by the American Realty Company, and so they're gushing about all this stuff. And situated in Cook County, Minnesota, on the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway, as an evidence of the never erring judgment and. Oh, sorry. It says the Gunflint Range is without an exception the most promising iron depository in northern part of the state of Minnesota. Talks about all the iron, etc. So, unfortunately, this is where sort of the story falls apart. It's perfect timing because we're almost done. So just as everything's starting to happen, the storm clouds start to gather, and it starts to happen in February of 1893. And it starts with the bankruptcy of an American railway called the Philadelphia and Reading. And that is sort of the trigger for this sort of world catastrophe. And unfortunately, what has happened up to this point is that particularly railways in the United States, and even some here in Canada, have been built on very, very shaky financing. It's almost like the real estate bubble that happened back in 2008, right? Where we had all this speculation that was going on. As well, in the United States, we also have the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, where the United States comes off the silver currency, and that has a huge impact on silver prices. And so what that does is it's almost like a domino effect. And so unfortunately what happens is iron prices basically nosedive. And so what we see particularly in the United States is we start to see people flocking to banks. At the time it was a very common thing that people were worried, right, that I have my money in the bank, and if the bank goes under, I'm going to lose all my money, right? So people start running to the banks and start taking their money out, right? I mean, obviously, we've seen changes to a lot of the way banks were run and the way they're set up, especially after what happened in 2008. But at the time, they didn't have these fail-safes, right? So people start taking their monies out of the bank, and so banks start to crash. And one of the banks that crashes as a result of this is the State Bank of Minneapolis, right? All of these people start taking their money out. We know, unfortunately, that they've taken some of the people's money and they've used it to buy lands and to pay for all of the work that's been done here. So as soon as that starts to happen, okay, everything just falls apart. The newspaper actually say that Court Guard is, what's the word that he said? He's prostrated. He basically collapses, right? He faints, or he has I don't know if he has a heart attack or what happens as a result of this, right? Because literally everything is now just falling apart. They basically lost their shirts. And so when the State Bank of Minneapolis goes under, the American Realty Company goes under, 121 years ago, July of 1893. And then the low iron prices and the fact that the American Realty Company has gone under basically closes the Gunflint mine, closes the Gunflint Company. And what really compounds that is, at the same time this is all happening, we see the discovery of the Mesabi Range, right? And the problem with the problem that creates is the iron. We know that there's iron in this area. We know there's a lot of iron. I'm not a geologist. The best that we can figure is that the problem with the iron in this area is it needs a lot of refining. It needs a lot of work to get it into, something that you can use, right? Maybe someday in the future it might be accessible. I know it's a little bit different now with the boundary waters being here, but I know our end of the Gunflint Range, I know they've been doing some exploring. The problem is that on the Mesabi Range, basically it's all open pit. You scoop it, you dump it, you scoop it, you dump it, right? And so all of a sudden now you've got way higher grade iron that's very easily accessible, and so you know, what's going to be the most economical way of getting the iron. So the fallout of all of this is that eventually Courtguard is arrested for embezzlement, and in 1894 he's convicted of that, and he's sent to jail for, I can't remember the original conviction, but he's out by 1896, and he eventually makes his way to bounces around a little bit, and eventually makes his way to Hoboken, New Jersey. How he ended up there, or what he was doing there, he, I think he dies there in the 1930s. Paulson, once again, sort of bounces around a little bit, and his name has been in my mind, like I said, because I've had this discussion with this lady from Minnesota State University. We don't know what happens immediately after this, but we know that he was married. He did have a wife by the name of Addie, and I didn't know this. I thought it was his real daughter, but apparently it's he had an adopted daughter by the name of Petra. She dies in Oklahoma in 1893, so it seems like he kind of got out of town pretty quick after this all sort of falls apart. So somehow or another, the family ends up in Oklahoma by 1893. The daughter dies. Addie dies there in 1900. They're in a little town called Alva, Oklahoma. And John Paulson ends up back in Minneapolis for a while, and then the next thing we hear of him in the 1914 census, he's in Oregon. And he's a farmer. He's a farmer in Oregon, and then at some point, it's kind of funny because his Civil War pension says that he dies in Oregon, but the state records here in Minnesota say that he died in, it says Hennepin County, so obviously somewhere around the Twin Cities. He dies in 1914. There is a photograph of him in his late 70s, or sorry, around the time he's in his 70s, I guess, around the time that he passed away. There's one unidentified person in the picture, and the other person he's with is Albert Rice, his old friend. So I guess it's a little bit of a reunion. All right, so we have the closure of the mine. The effects on the railway are catastrophic, right? Basically, the whole purpose of building the railway into this area is to get to that iron. And now, when the mine closes, you have a railway that literally goes to nowhere, right? There is no reason for the railway to come here, and that was the railway's main source of revenue. The railway has debts to pay. There's maintenance, or all kinds of things, and so what ends up happening with the railway is it just loses money. Bleeds money for the next 7 years until it's sold in a bankruptcy sale to eventually what will become the Canadian Northern Railway. And then the Canadian Northern Railway owns it for approximately the next 20 years until they are amalgamated into the Canadian National Railway. And the Canadian National owns it until 1938 when they basically abandon it. And the railway's abandoned in stages. Canadian Northern, one of the first things they do when they take over it, they basically stop running trains to Gunflint. So there's no reason to run trains to Gunflint. There's nothing here. There's barely any people living here. And so the last little chapter of this whole story happens on August 28th, 1893. And if you want to take a look at the picture, they have a copy of the picture here in the museum. Is a little, I don't know what to call it. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. I don't know if it's like a photo op or a publicity stunt or what it is. The only iron that was ever taken out of the Paulson mine. Basically, we have a very important visit that's happening. The Premier of Ontario, Sir Oliver Mowat, is visiting Thunder Bay, and so they stage this, like I said, a photo op. I don't know how else to do it. They take a very famous photograph at Whitefish Lake, which is about mile 45 of the railway. And so basically there's the train with the one flat bed of iron from the Paulson mine, and all the dignitaries kind of clustered around it. They take the picture. What is ironic is the day that picture is taken, it's the same day that the Paulson mine officially closes, right? And so, it's a case of, I guess, a little bit too late, a little too late, or however you want to word it. And so unfortunately that really is the end of really the railway and the mine. Like I said, the railway kind of staggers on for the next 40 years or so. But never really recovered from that. And there were many attempts to try to reopen the Paulson mine. There were a few that happened in the 1890s. They tried to look for nickel, and then around the turn of the century, they tried to get the iron going again, and that didn't work. And then they tried again in the 1920s, the early 1920s. There was a firm out of Chicago that tried to open up the mine. I actually have I don't know if it's a stock certificate. I got it on eBay. If it's thing from. I was talking about the sale of a certain quantity of iron or something like that. So, unfortunately, that's how all this all transpired. And had things sort of played out a little differently, maybe the history of this area might have been very different. Certainly a lot of the things that especially on the Minnesota end of things, the boundary waters and the nature that is here, maybe that would have been very, very different had there been a big iron industry here and trains running through. And so that's my presentation. Went a little bit over the 45 minutes, but there's always a lot to say. So once again, thanks to everybody for coming out. Thank you to the Chik-Wauk Museum and the Gunflint Trail Historical Society for allowing me to come here and speak again. And thank you to all of you for coming out and listening. And always, all the little tidbits aren't always exciting, but hopefully you found the presentation informative. And like I said, afterwards, on your way out, I do have cards here. If you want to grab a card, I do have a large presence on the internet. If you want to get in touch with me, there is my email address. I have a website, a blog, YouTube, Facebook. Always lots of information, pictures, and things like that out there. So yeah, thanks again.